The crisp morning air smelled of hay and fresh earth as Dr. Ethan Hayes stepped out onto his sprawling, 3-acre property. As a veterinarian specializing in equine medicine, owning a horse was more than just a passion. It was his life's work. His home sat on the edge of a picturesque neighborhood, a rare gem in a suburb slowly being swallowed by cookie-cutter developments. The small barn he built out back was his personal sanctuary, a place where he could unwind after long shifts at the clinic. But today, his usual morning routine was interrupted by a sight that made his stomach churn. A fluorescent orange violation notice flapped against his mailbox like a taunting flag. He pulled it off, his eyes narrowing as he read. HOA violation notice. You are in direct violation of HOA Code 17.4. Unauthorized livestock on residential property. Failure to comply within 14 days will result in escalating fines and possible legal action. Ethan sighed, running a hand through his short, sun-bleached hair. Here we go, he muttered. He didn't need to read the fine print to know who was behind this nonsense. Karen Whitmore, self-appointed queen of the HOA. She was the type who took her role as neighborhood enforcer way too seriously. The kind who spent her days peering out from behind expensive lace curtains, clipboard in hand, looking for the slightest deviation from her perfect community standards. And apparently, a single horse on a 3-acre property was her newest crusade. Before Ethan could even step back inside, he heard the unmistakable click-clack of expensive heels on pavement. Karen was already approaching, flanked by 2 other board members. She was dressed in a power suit far too formal for a casual Saturday morning, her blonde bob stiff with hairspray. "Dr. Hayes," she greeted, her voice dripping with faux politeness. "I assume you've seen the notice?" Ethan folded his arms, leaning against his porch railing. "Yeah, I saw it. Mind explaining why I'm getting fined for having a horse on my own property?" Karen's painted-on smile didn't waver. The Homeowners Association has strict guidelines against livestock in residential areas. It's in the bylaws. Horses are classified as livestock. He chuckled dryly. "Karen, I've lived here for 5 years. I had this property before the HOA even existed." "Well," she said, her tone sharpening, "times change. We voted on these regulations last year. You should have attended the meetings if you wanted a say." Ethan let out a slow breath. He knew exactly how those meetings worked, rigged in favor of Karen and her circle, with last-minute votes and barely legal policy changes. He glanced over at his barn where Apollo, his beloved Arabian gelding, stood lazily flicking his tail. "You realize I'm a veterinarian, right?" Ethan said. "Horses are literally my job. This isn't just some backyard hobby." Karen's lips pursed. "That doesn't exempt you from following the rules. You have 14 days to relocate the animal, or face a $500 fine for every additional week of noncompliance." Ethan exhaled slowly, clenching the notice in his fist. He knew when someone was trying to intimidate him, and he wasn't backing down. "This is ridiculous," he said. "I'm not getting rid of my horse. And if you think I'm paying a fine for something that isn't even illegal, you're out of your mind." Karen's eyes gleamed. She loved power trips, and the fact that Ethan was resisting only seemed to fuel her smugness. "Then I guess we'll have to take other measures," she said, turning on her heel. "Have a nice day, Dr. Hayes." Ethan watched them strut away, already planning his next move. He had no idea what kind of fight Karen had just started, but she was about to learn that messing with a vet who knew the law was a terrible idea. HOA's first power move. Ethan had dealt with stubborn animals before, fractious stallions, unpredictable rescues, but none were as relentless as Karen Whitmore. By Monday morning, the fines escalated. A thick envelope was taped to his door when he got home from the clinic. He ripped it open and skimmed the contents. Second notice of violation. Your failure to comply has resulted in an additional $750 fine. Continued noncompliance will lead to legal action, potential property liens, and other penalties in accordance with HOA policy. Ethan clenched his jaw. This was exactly the kind of bureaucratic nonsense that made people despise HOAs. His phone buzzed. His neighbor Julia had sent a text. "Julia, heads up. Karen's been going door to door ranting about you. She told the board she'll make an example out of you." Ethan exhaled slowly. So that was her game. He shoved the notice in his back pocket and headed inside, only for his doorbell to ring 2 minutes later. He didn't even have to check the peephole. Karen stood on his porch, arms folded, flanked by an official-looking man in a cheap suit. "Dr. Hayes," Karen greeted, smiling like a shark. "This is Richard Lomax, our HOA's compliance officer." We're here to ensure you understand the consequences of your refusal to abide by community standards. Ethan leaned against the doorframe. You mean the standards you pulled out of thin air? Because I checked. This county has no ordinance against keeping a horse on private property. Karen's nostrils flared, but Richard cleared his throat. The HOA has the right to enforce its own regulations. You agreed to the bylaws when you signed your deed. Did I? Ethan crossed his arms. Because I bought this property before your HOA even existed. And I never signed your revised bylaws. Karen's eye twitched. She hadn't expected him to know that. Richard shuffled through his folder, flipping past pages as if he was stalling. Regardless, Dr. Hayes, if you don't remove the horse, we will have no choice but to pursue further action. Great, Ethan said. Because I'd love to see how that plays out in a real courtroom. Karen's jaw tightened. We'll see about that. She turned, heels clicking furiously, storming back to her car. Richard hesitated, looking slightly uncomfortable. He muttered something about just doing his job before hurrying after her. Ethan watched them leave, a smirk playing on his lips. They thought they could scare him? They had no idea who they were dealing with. But he wasn't prepared for what happened next. The escalation begins. By Wednesday morning, an inspector was at his gate. Ethan was feeding Apollo when the county vehicle pulled up. A man in a city uniform stepped out, clipboard in hand. Dr. Hayes, the man asked. I'm with the zoning department. We got a complaint about an unauthorized livestock structure on your property. Ethan exhaled sharply. Karen, you mean my barn? He asked, gesturing to the fully permitted structure. The inspector glanced at his clipboard. Says here the structure is non-compliant with HOA regulations. Ethan chuckled. Yeah, well, the HOA doesn't run the county, does it? The inspector rubbed his temple. Look, I already checked the permit records before coming out here. Everything is up to code. But since there was a formal complaint, I had to come inspect. Ethan folded his arms. Let me guess. The complaint came from a blonde with a superiority complex. The inspector snorted. I didn't say that. But I will say this. She called 3 times this morning. Ethan shook his head. She's obsessed. What happens now? Now. The inspector snapped his folder shut. Now I go back and file a report clearing you of any violations. I'll also be letting them know that if they keep abusing city resources for personal vendettas, we might have to fine them. That made Ethan grin. Karen doubles down. That afternoon, Ethan was back at work when his phone buzzed. Another text from Julia. Julia, Karen's been patrolling your house like a vulture. And she had the HOA send out an email. Check your inbox. Ethan opened his email, and sure enough, there it was. Subject: HOA emergency meeting, Dr. Hayes property violations. Dear homeowners, the HOA board will be meeting this Friday to discuss the serious violations occurring at 112 Maple Grove Lane. Any homeowner concerned about property values and community safety should attend. Regards, Karen Whitmore, HOA president. Ethan almost laughed out loud. Community safety? Did Karen think Apollo was going to terrorize the neighborhood? It was time to put an end to this nonsense. Time to fight back. Ethan cracked his knuckles. If Karen wanted a war, she was about to get one. And she had no idea how badly she was going to lose. The HOA escalates the conflict. By the time Friday evening rolled around, Ethan was ready for war. The HOA had scheduled their emergency meeting at the community clubhouse, a sterile, overpriced building that Karen had pushed the HOA to fund, even though no one actually wanted it. Ethan arrived 10 minutes early, strolling in like he owned the place. A few neighbors gave him uneasy nods, while others avoided eye contact. It was clear Karen had been running her mouth all week, stirring up panic over his illegal horse. At the front of the room, Karen sat like a queen on her throne, flanked by her usual cronies. She smirked when she saw Ethan. Ah, Dr. Hayes, she said. So glad you could join us. Ethan took a seat near the front, casually leaning back in his chair. Wouldn't miss it for the world, Karen. Karen cleared her throat and called the meeting to order. Ladies and gentlemen, she began, we are here today to address a serious violation that threatens the integrity of our neighborhood. Ethan resisted the urge to roll his eyes. As you all know, Karen continued, our HOA bylaws prohibit livestock in residential areas. Despite repeated warnings, Dr. Hayes has refused to comply. His continued defiance forces us to consider more serious consequences. A few murmurs spread through the room. Ethan folded his arms. Now hold on. One of the board members, a gray-haired man named Tom, spoke up. I thought we were just issuing fines. What do you mean by serious consequences? Karen's lips tightened. She didn't like being questioned. Well, Tom, she said sweetly, if fines aren't enough, we can move to place a lien on his property. If he still refuses to comply, we have legal pathways to pursue eviction. That got the reaction she wanted. Gasps. Shocked whispers. Ethan laughed. Everyone turned to stare at him. Sorry, he said, shaking his head. I just can't believe you actually think you have the power to evict me from my own property. Karen's eyes narrowed. This is not a joke, Dr. Hayes. The HOA has full authority to enforce its regulations. Actually, Ethan interrupted, you don't. Karen's face reddened. Excuse me? Ethan pulled out a folder and placed it on the table in front of him. See, I did some research. Turns out your new livestock bylaw? It was never properly filed with the county. That means it's not legally enforceable. Karen's smirk wavered. You're lying, she snapped. Ethan opened the folder and pulled out printed documents. Here's a copy of the county's property zoning laws, he said. And here's the HOA's own bylaw submission records. Notice anything missing? Tom leaned over and squinted at the papers. Wait a minute, he muttered. He's right. There's no official record of this livestock rule being approved by the county. Karen's smug expression cracked. That's not possible, she sputtered. Oui. You tried to sneak it in without going through proper channels, Ethan said. And now, it's worthless. The murmurs turned into full-blown whispers. Several homeowners were now glaring at Karen. Hold on, one woman said. Are you saying she's been fining him over a fake rule? Looks like it, Ethan said. Karen stiffened. That doesn't change the fact that. Oh, but it does, Ethan cut in. Because it means every fine you've issued under that rule is fraudulent. And guess what? That's illegal. Karen's face turned a dangerous shade of red. Tom stood up. Karen, if this is true, we could be personally liable for this. Karen whipped around to face him. Sit down, Tom, she snapped. But Tom didn't sit down. Neither did 3 other board members. One of them, a middle-aged woman named Lisa, crossed her arms. You never told us the county hadn't approved this bylaw. Because it doesn't matter. Karen snapped. I'm protecting our neighborhood. From what? Ethan asked, smirking. My horse. That got a few chuckles from the crowd. Karen's control was slipping. And Ethan wasn't done yet. The investigation begins. After the meeting, Tom pulled Ethan aside. Listen, he said quietly. I've had my doubts about Karen for a while. But this? If she's been lying about this, there's no telling what else she's been doing. Ethan nodded. Then let's find out. And that's when things got interesting. Digging into HOA corruption. Over the next week, Ethan started digging deeper. It didn't take long to find red flags. HOA funds weren't adding up. Violation fines were being deposited into an unregistered account. Certain homeowners, Karen's friends, were suspiciously exempt from rules. The more Ethan uncovered, the clearer it became. Karen wasn't just a control freak. She was running a scam. But before he could expose her, Karen made her biggest mistake yet. And this time she crossed the line. The HOA oversteps and the protagonist strikes back. Ethan knew Karen was losing control. The moment he exposed the fraudulent bylaw at the HOA meeting, cracks began forming in her kingdom. But Karen wasn't the type to back down gracefully. And her next move, it was so blatantly illegal that Ethan almost couldn't believe her audacity. The HOA's most reckless move yet. It was Tuesday morning when Ethan woke up to the sound of heavy machinery outside. He stumbled out onto his porch, coffee in hand, only to freeze. A tow truck was backing up toward his barn. His barn. Hey! Ethan shouted, storming down the steps. What the hell do you think you're doing? A burly man in a neon vest glanced at him. Orders from the HOA, he said, jerking a thumb toward the clipboard in his hand. We're here to seize your unauthorized structure. Ethan's blood ran cold. They were trying to tow his barn. His permitted, legally constructed barn. And standing a few feet away, arms crossed and smiling smugly, was Karen. Good morning, Dr. Hayes, she said, her voice dripping with fake politeness. I assume you've read the final violation notice we sent. Ethan stalked toward her, rage burning in his veins. Are you insane? You can't just destroy my property. Karen feigned innocence. Oh, but I can. Per HOA regulations, we are authorized to remove non-compliant structures after multiple warnings. Ethan exhaled slowly, trying to stay calm. Karen, my barn is fully permitted. You have zero legal authority to do this. Karen's smirk didn't waver. Then feel free to file a complaint with the board. The tow truck revved its engine. Apollo, spooked by the noise, whinnied inside the barn. That was the last straw. Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed the police. 911, what's your emergency? Yeah, I have an unauthorized demolition attempt happening on my property. Private contractors, hired by my HOA, trying to tow a legally permitted structure. I need an officer here now. Karen's smirk faltered. She didn't expect Ethan to go straight for law enforcement. But he wasn't done yet. The tables turn. 10 minutes later, a sheriff's cruiser rolled up. The tow truck driver immediately cut the engine. He didn't look like the type who wanted trouble with the law. The sheriff, a tall man in his 40s with grizzled patience, stepped out. Who called this in? Ethan stepped forward. That would be me, Sheriff. I own this property, and these guys were hired by my HOA to illegally remove my barn. The sheriff turned to Karen. Ma'am, do you have a court order authorizing this demolition? Karen's smug expression cracked. The HOA has the right. The sheriff held up a hand. Ma'am, I didn't ask about HOA policies. I asked if you have a legal court order. Silence. Ethan crossed his arms. You don't, do you? Karen's face flushed. I don't need one. The sheriff sighed. That's not how this works. If you don't have a court order, this is destruction of private property. He turned to the tow truck driver. You need to leave. Now. The driver didn't need to be told twice. He hopped into his truck and sped off before Karen could even react. Ethan had never enjoyed watching someone panic more. The sheriff faced Karen again. Ma'am, I strongly suggest you don't try this again. If you step onto his property without permission, you'll be looking at trespassing charges. Karen opened and closed her mouth like a fish. Then, without another word, she turned and stormed off. Ethan let out a slow breath. Round 1 victory. But this wasn't over. Exposing the HOA's corruption. That night, Ethan went all in. With help from Tom, the HOA board member who had started questioning Karen, he compiled every shady financial record they could find. The evidence was damning. Fines issued under fake rules. Payments funneled into unregistered accounts. Certain homeowners mysteriously exempt from violations. The next morning, Ethan sent the full report to 2 places. White heavy checkmark the County Housing Authority. White heavy checkmark a local investigative reporter. Karen's panic begins. By Friday, the HOA was in full-blown meltdown mode. Neighbors were furious when they learned the truth. Tom called Ethan that evening. Karen is freaking out. She knows you sent that report in, and she's scrambling. Ethan grinned. Good. Because now, Karen wasn't just facing angry neighbors. She was facing a full-scale investigation. And she had no one to blame but herself. Karen's final, desperate move. Karen was desperate. Ethan could feel it in the air. The neighborhood, once filled with fearful compliance, was now buzzing with rebellion. The HOA board was fracturing, neighbors were demanding explanations, and the local news had already reached out for an on-camera interview. Karen was losing control, and that made her dangerous. Karen's last stand. Ethan was in his barn, brushing down Apollo, when his phone buzzed. A message from Julia. Julia, dude. Karen is standing outside your house right now. She's got some guy with a clipboard. It looks serious. Ethan's gut tightened. He stepped out of the barn, and, sure enough, there she was. Karen stood on his driveway, arms folded tightly, flanked by a city official. She turned as soon as she spotted him, smiling like she'd already won. Dr. Hayes, she called out sweetly. I hope you have a moment to chat. Ethan strolled up to them, calm and unimpressed. Not really, but I'll humor you. What now? Karen tilted her head. Oh, just some official business. The man next to her cleared his throat. Sir, I'm with the County Property Inspection Office. We received a report that your barn was built without proper permits. I'm here to conduct an inspection. Ethan laughed. He actually laughed out loud. Karen's eye twitched. Is something funny? Ethan grinned, pulling out his phone. I was just thinking. I should probably call my friend Mike. You know, the zoning commissioner? Karen's smirk wavered. Ethan tapped his screen, put the call on speaker, and held it up. Mike, hey, it's Ethan, he said. Listen, I've got a county inspector here telling me my fully permitted barn is suddenly an issue. Any idea what that's about? A pause. Then, that's bull, Mike cleared his throat. That's nonsense, Ethan. Your permits are solid. Who's the inspector? The man beside Karen went pale. Ethan smirked. Hang on, Mike. I'll ask him. He turned to the inspector. So, who exactly sent you? The man looked like he wanted to sink into the earth. We received a formal complaint. Ethan nodded. Uh-huh. And did that complaint happen to come from this woman right here? Silence. Mike's voice boomed through the phone. You tell that inspector to leave immediately. If this is some HOA stunt, I'll be looking into it myself. Karen's face burned red. The inspector mumbled an apology and bolted. Ethan turned back to Karen, grinning. You're really reaching now, huh? Karen's fists clenched. This isn't over. Oh, but it is, Ethan said. You just don't know it yet. Karen crosses the line and gets caught. That night, Ethan's security cameras picked up something shocking. At 2:14 a.m., a dark figure crept onto his property. It was Karen. She was sneaking toward his barn, holding a can of spray paint. Ethan watched the footage from his phone, disbelief turning into a slow smirk. She was trying to frame him, probably planning to vandalize his own barn, then file another bogus complaint. But what Karen didn't realize was that Ethan's security system had motion-activated floodlights. Busted. The second she stepped too close, the lights blasted on. Karen froze like a deer in headlights. Then she panicked. She turned to run, but tripped, falling flat on her face. The spray can rolled out of her hand as she scrambled to her feet and sprinted off the property. Ethan was laughing so hard he could barely breathe. The fallout begins. By morning, Ethan had downloaded the footage and sent it straight to the HOA board. Then, just for fun, he forwarded a copy to the local news. By noon, the entire neighborhood was watching the video. And Karen was finished. HOA crumbles and Karen's downfall. By noon, Karen's trespassing stunt was the talk of the neighborhood. Ethan didn't even have to say a word. The security footage spoke for itself. Neighbors forwarded the video, the HOA board erupted in chaos. And by the afternoon, Karen's precious reign of terror was crumbling. The emergency HOA meeting. At 6 p.m. sharp, an emergency HOA meeting was called. Only this time, it wasn't to harass Ethan. This time, it was Karen on trial. Ethan strolled in, taking a front-row seat. The room was packed. Karen sat at the table, livid but silent, flanked by two remaining allies. Tom, the board member who had grown increasingly suspicious of Karen, stood at the podium. He cleared his throat. We've all seen the footage, Tom began. And let's be clear, trespassing on a homeowner's property is a crime. Murmurs spread through the room. Karen shifted in her seat. Tom continued. That's not even the worst of it. After reviewing financial records, we've uncovered serious discrepancies. HOA funds have been, shall we say, misallocated. Karen's head snapped up. That's a lie. Tom held up a folder. We have bank statements, Karen. Silence. Someone in the crowd muttered. She's been stealing from us. Karen paled. I was just allocating resources where they were needed. Ethan chuckled. Ah, yes. Allocating resources. Is that what you call illegally funneling HOA fines into a private account? Karen's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The board members were done protecting her. We're calling for an immediate vote, Tom said. Effective tonight, Karen Whitmore is removed as HOA president. A wave of satisfaction spread through the crowd. But Karen wasn't done yet. Karen's last, pathetic plea. Wait! Karen shot up from her chair. I built this community. You can't just throw me out. Tom folded his arms. Watch us. Karen's face twisted in desperation. She turned to Ethan, as if he was her last hope. Dr. Hayes, she pleaded. You have to understand. I was just trying to protect property values. If people like you. Ethan's brows shot up. People like me? Karen stammered. I mean people who bring in animals. Ethan leaned forward. Karen, I'm a veterinarian. You were never worried about property values. You were just on a power trip. Karen's face burned red. Tom sighed. The motion to remove Karen is in effect. A resounding chorus of aye filled the room. Karen was done. HOA faces full legal consequences. By the next morning, the fallout was in full swing. Karen was removed as president. The HOA was under legal review. Multiple homeowners, Ethan included, began preparing lawsuits. Ethan received a text from Tom. Tom, the county is investigating. Looks like Karen might be in serious trouble. Ethan smirked. Karen's ultimate defeat. A few days later, Ethan was grabbing his mail when he spotted something glorious. A moving truck. Karen stood by her front yard, red-faced, barking orders at the movers. Her house had been listed overnight. She was getting out of town. Ethan leaned on his fence. Leaving so soon? Karen stiffened but didn't look at him. Ethan chuckled. If you need a vet recommendation for your next HOA nightmare, let me know. Karen stormed inside. Victory had never felt so sweet. The HOA faces full legal consequences. With Karen officially out of power, the rest of the HOA board was scrambling to save face. But Ethan wasn't about to let them off the hook. The HOA's reckoning begins. 2 weeks after Karen's downfall, Ethan received a formal letter from the County Housing Authority. Notice of investigation. The Maple Grove HOA is under formal review for financial mismanagement, illegal enforcement of bylaws, and fraudulent fine collection. Ethan smirked. Good. Tom, now serving as the interim board president, reached out. Tom, just a heads up, the county is about to start auditing the HOA's books. Tom, if what we found already is bad, I can't imagine what they'll uncover. Ethan leaned back in his chair. Karen had been pocketing money for years, and now? It was all coming back to bite her. Lawsuits and HOA collapse. The more homeowners learned about Karen's shady dealings, the angrier they got. It started with a few complaints. Then came a full-blown class action lawsuit. Ethan, along with several neighbors, filed claims for the fraudulent fines Karen had issued. And it didn't stop there. The county found enough evidence of financial misconduct to slap the HOA with massive penalties. Tens of thousands of dollars in wrongful fines had to be refunded. HOA board members who enabled Karen were forced to step down. Karen herself was under investigation for potential fraud charges. The HOA was hemorrhaging money trying to fight off lawsuits. By the end of the month, the board had no choice but to dissolve the HOA entirely. Ethan's final power move. One morning, Tom swung by Ethan's place. Well, Tom said, it's official. The Maple Grove HOA is dead. Ethan grinned. Music to my ears. Tom shook his head, chuckling. You really did it, man. You took down an entire HOA. Ethan shrugged. Karen did it to herself. I just gave her a little push. With the HOA gone, Ethan could finally enjoy his property in peace. And Karen? Well, she still had one more humiliating defeat left to face. Karen's personal downfall. With the HOA officially dissolved, the neighborhood was finally free. No more ridiculous fines, no more power-hungry Karen lurking around, and most importantly, Ethan's horse could stay. But as satisfying as it was to watch the HOA crumble, Ethan couldn't help but wonder. What happened to Karen? The aftermath of a fallen tyrant. Word spread quickly that Karen's house had been foreclosed. It turned out that not only had she been mismanaging HOA funds, but she had also been using her own money to cover legal fees once the lawsuits started rolling in. Now, she was completely broke. Ethan was at the local coffee shop when Julia slid into the seat across from him, grinning like she had the best gossip of the year. You are not going to believe where Karen ended up, she said. Ethan sipped his coffee, amused. Oh, do tell. Julia pulled out her phone, scrolled for a second, and then turned the screen toward him. It was a photo of Karen, sitting behind the front desk of a property management office. The ironic twist of fate. Ethan squinted. Wait a second. Is she? Julia nodded, barely containing her laughter. Yep, she said. Karen had to take a job working for another HOA. Ethan choked on his coffee. You're telling me the woman who spent her whole life terrorizing homeowners is now a glorified desk clerk for some corporate HOA? Poetic justice, huh? Julia smirked. Ethan leaned back, laughing. Karma really came for her. Karen had spent years wielding power over others, making their lives miserable. And now? She was just another cog in the HOA machine, forced to follow rules she used to enforce on everyone else. The final humiliation. The next time Ethan saw Karen, it was purely by chance. He was walking out of a hardware store when he spotted her, wearing a stiff name tag, standing in front of a HOA complaint booth. Her posture was rigid, her face tired, and when she saw him, her expression darkened. Ethan simply gave her a polite nod. Hope you're enjoying the new job, he said, smirking. Karen's eye twitched, but she said nothing. Instead, she turned back to the stack of HOA paperwork in front of her, silently living in the nightmare she once forced onto others. And Ethan? He walked away grinning. Justice had been served. Epilogue and final mic drop. With Karen gone and the HOA dissolved, life in the neighborhood finally felt normal. No more ridiculous fines. No more Karen lurking with her clipboard. No more unnecessary rules about fence heights, mailbox colors, or horses. Just peace and quiet. A new era for the neighborhood. Ethan sat on his porch, sipping a cup of coffee while Apollo grazed peacefully in the field. Julia strolled up the driveway, hands in her pockets. "Well, it's official," she said, smirking. "The last HOA signs have been taken down. It's like she was never here." Ethan chuckled. "I almost miss her." Julia raised a brow. "Really?" He grinned. "No, not even a little." She laughed, shaking her head. "So, what's next for you, Dr. Hayes? Gonna start your own HOA?" Ethan snorted. "Over my dead body." The final mic drop. A few days later, Ethan got a surprise in the mail. A letter with no return address. Inside was a single piece of paper. A fake HOA violation notice. Violation notice. Crime, being too damn stubborn. Fine, 1 coffee paid to Julia. Ethan burst out laughing. He looked out toward the field, watching Apollo flick his tail in the sunshine. This was his home, and no power-hungry HOA tyrant was ever going to take it away. With a satisfied smirk, Ethan grabbed his keys and headed to the coffee shop. He had a debt to pay.